Ok. Pues hola, bienvenidos a todos los que nos están escuchando a este nuestro segundo encuentro de Colbe Coag, Voces y Acciones ante el Abuso Sexual. Enfrentando el pasado, crecemos hoy. Ese es así el tema que le pusimos. La verdad es que no quiero alargar mucho. Hoy no me queda nada más que agradecer de todo mi corazón. Primero que nada, pues ya sabemos a Dios que nos ha acompañado en cada momento y que sin Él hemos visto ahora sí que milagros. Nos ha acompañado a lograr cada cosa. A todo el equipo de Colbe Coag, híjole, de verdad me encantaría mencionar a cada uno, pero no lo hago por temor a no darle su lugar a alguno y que se vaya, ni Dios lo quiera, sentir mal. No hay palabras para decirle a las personas que son cada uno, gente profesional, gente entregada, pero sobre todo con una humanidad maravillosa y que trabajan de corazón. De verdad, tómenselo a cada uno personalmente. Es un equipo maravilloso. Gracias a cada uno, las personas de Colbe Coag, el equipo de educadoras, un maravilloso equipo, el equipo de profesionales, todas las personas que nos ayudan también profesionalmente, a todas las comunidades, les agradezco de todo nuestro corazón porque desde el principio nos apoyaron en todo momento, a la línea 1118 que está de la mano con nosotros. Pero la verdad, hoy quiero hacer un especial agradecimiento y un reconocimiento, obviamente, y son a todas ustedes personas que nos están escuchando. ¿Por qué? Porque uno de nuestros principios es, se necesita de toda una comunidad para crear un ambiente seguro para nuestros niños. Pero también se necesita toda una comunidad para prevenirlo. A estos niños vulnerables, a estos niños que necesitan de unos adultos que los protejan. Y hoy, todos ustedes que nos están escuchando, son esas personas que están dando el paso de prevenir y de proteger a nuestros hijos, que están tomando la iniciativa de entrar hoy a estas pláticas para hacer conciencia, para informarnos, y hoy están haciendo esa comunidad segura para prevenir el abuso a nuestros niños. La verdad es un honor, un privilegio contar con profesionales como los que tenemos hoy. Welcome, Dr. Bruce. Welcome, Dr. Diane. Welcome, Debbie. Thank you very much. And really, it's a pleasure for us. Hoy tenemos el privilegio de tener aquí a una de las personas que más nos ha apoyado, al señor Abdo Chacalo, presidente de la comunidad Maguen David, una persona profesional, humana. Y bueno, bienvenido, Abdo. Si nos puedes, por favor, dedicar unas palabras. Bienvenidos a todos.
Gracias, Alice. Gracias. Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Es para mí un honor, un privilegio poder estar aquí, dirigir unas palabras a ustedes y aprovechar la ocasión para agradecer a todo el equipo de Colbe Coag que han hecho a través de estos años un trabajo magnífico, maravilloso. Ya es una organización reconocida, no nada más en la comunidad o a nivel intercomunitario, sino inclusive han rebasado fronteras a nivel nacional. Pues agradecer a todos los que colaboran. Esther Laneado, por tu trabajo durante tantos años, Mosde, todos, Alice, especialmente ahorita tú, y felicitarlos por esta iniciativa, este gran congreso, y bueno, a todos los ponentes, sabemos que son ponentes de primer nivel, y también los receptores, a toda la gente que estará tomando estas ponencias, por su interés de poder estar en este seminario para poder beneficiar a toda la gente que lo necesita. Y déjenme decirles, yo tengo un sentimiento encontrado cuando existen este tipo de iniciativas. Por un lado, un poquito de frustración, enojo por tener que, hay veces, pues, tener que atender este tipo de situaciones. No sé si cuando nosotros éramos niños existían o es un mundo cambiante que a través de los años esto ha proliferado y se ha expandido y ha crecido, o realmente es algo que estaba oculto y se ha abierto y se ha destapado en los últimos años. Y bueno, ese enojo de saber que en este mundo enfermizo existe gente con esta situación de abusar y de meterse con los niños. Pero el otro sentimiento es un sentimiento de alegría y tranquilidad de saber que hay gente con el interés, que hay gente con las herramientas, gente con la capacidad de poder atender y estar preocupada por el bienestar de nuestros niños. Y que gracias a Dios hoy, bueno, tenemos una institución, una organización como es Colbecoag, con todo el equipo y con todos los profesionales que nos permiten poder atender y nos dan tranquilidad de que por lo menos hoy estamos en un tema de prevención y atención cuando se requiere, pero el estar previniendo a nuestros niños, preparándolos para que esto no suceda. Y bueno, quería compartir esos sentimientos y por supuesto una vez más agradecer a todos los que participan por su profesionalismo, por su entrega, por el interés y por ayudar a tantos niños. Todos los ponentes, veo aquí al Dr. Bruce. Thank you for joining us in this webinar. It's a pleasure, and we hope that people will enjoy your potential of this seminar. Y bueno, no me queda más que de agradecerles a todos y que disfruten, aprovechen de esta gran oportunidad que les brinda Colbecoag. Muchas gracias a todos. Buen día. Yo me tengo que despedir, no me puedo quedar. Me encantaría poder quedarme un rato, pero mi agenda hoy no me lo permite. Pero que lo disfruten mucho. Gracias. Buen día a todos.
Muchas gracias, Abdo. Tomamos muy en cuenta tus palabras y créenos que estamos trabajando durísimo para que este problema, que como tú dices, si existía o no existía, hoy existe y estamos trabajando para resolverlo. Es un honor para mí presentar al doctor Bruce Perry y voy a hacer su presentación en inglés. Los que quieran pueden escoger ahí abajo en el Zoom, hay un mundito y pueden escoger la traducción en español. Me gustaría también decirles que todas las preguntas que pudieran tener pueden escribirlas en el chat y nosotros se las vamos a dirigir al doctor Bruce Perry y posteriormente vamos a recibir sus respuestas. No va a haber sección de preguntas y respuestas, sino que vamos a mandar todas las preguntas y el doctor va a ser tan amable de contestarlas. Dr. Bruce Perry is principal of the Neurosequential Model Network, LLC, and senior fellow of the Child Trauma Academy, a community of practice based in Houston, Texas. He is also professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in Chicago, and the School of Allied Health, College of Science, Health and Engineering in La Trobe University, Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. Dr. Perry is the author of over 500 journal articles, book chapters, and scientific proceedings. His clinical research over the last 10 years has been focused on integrating emerging principles of developmental neuroscience into clinical practice. This work has resulted in development of innovative clinical practices and programs, working with maltreated and traumatized children, most prominently the neurosequential model, a developmentally sensitive neurobiology-informed approach to clinical work, education, and caregiving. En español, quisiera decir que es director del Neurosequential Model Network, profesor emérito de The Child Trauma Academy, coautor del libro El chico a quien criaron como perro, un libro muy famoso. El título de la plática que vamos a tener con el doctor Bruce se titula Six Core Strengths for Healthy Childhood Development, 6 fortalezas básicas para un desarrollo sano en la infancia. Y con esto me gustaría darle la palabra al doctor Bruce Perry. Welcome, Dr. Bruce. It is a real honor to have you in this meeting. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. And I truly appreciate the opportunity to share some of our work. I have to say I'm a little bit, I said before we started, I'm a little bit challenged all of the time when I have these opportunities, because I'm part of a very large network of clinicians and organizations across the world, and all of them are doing really, really interesting, good work that I think may be relevant to the topic. And I'm always trying to figure out how to pick the parts of our work that we do that will be useful for people and sort of topical to the times. So really what I want to do today is talk a little bit about stress and the role that stress plays in healthy development, and help people appreciate that as challenging as these times are, they may provide an opportunity to learn more about resilience and potentially to actually help build resilience. So the second thing I should warn you that I'm actually a very slide dependent presenter. So this is what I look like. And from now on, I'm going to be showing my slides. So give me one moment here and I'll get my screen up. And I'm going to jump between a couple of different presentations. Let me start with this one. And the first is provide a little bit of information about where you can get more materials if you want, get access to either video clips or print materials that will expand on some of the concepts that I'm presenting. So probably the best place to start would be with this place right here. There's a lot of downloadable PDFs that will include many of the slides that I'll present today, and that's a good place to start. For those of you who are interested in some of these concepts as they're presented through the lens of the current pandemic, we've created a lot of multimedia content that is targeted mostly at interdisciplinary teams, but it also may be potentially relevant for families and other people who may not have any formal training in mental health or biology and so forth. So those are the places you can get a little bit more information about this work. And the first thing I want to point out, and this is something that is, I think, a very important point. Stress is something that is, it's a ubiquitous part of everyday life. And if you are thinking about stress from the perspective of a biologist, it's a little bit different than the way kind of the lay public thinks about stress. Almost all the time when we tend to use the term stress in everyday language, we're talking about something that's negative. But in fact, stress is something that helps build healthy systems. And I think one of the easiest ways to think about it is if you are someone who has decided to start exercising and you want to get in, quote, in shape, the only way to make your cardiovascular system and your lungs and your muscles be stronger is to stress them. And the way we stress them is to exercise. And you huff and you puff and you lift weights and you walk further and you run further. And so you literally are taking these systems and you're stressing them. But the way you stress them is important. You stress them in a predictable way. You know you're going to go for a walk. You know you're going to go lift weights. You stress them in a controllable way. You know that if you have the goal of running a mile, but you get to 3/4 of a mile, you have control over slowing down or stopping. And then the third thing is that the stress is moderate. It's not completely overwhelming. You don't work these systems to death. You work them to a certain moderate challenge, and then you get back to your baseline, you stop. And this is really, really important because in truth, this stress activation, the pattern of stress activation that we're talking about, where there's predictability, moderation, and controllability, that leads to resilience. It leads to a stronger stress response capability. And this is, of course, what we want for our children. We want our children to have the ability to tolerate some of the unpredictabilities that are going to happen in life. We want them to be able to tolerate the challenge of getting up in front of their class and reciting a poem that they memorized. We want them to be able to tolerate the challenge of somebody who's, being a bully. And so life is going to serve up a whole variety of challenges. And the more flexible and strong our children's stress response system is, the more capable they'll be of dealing with that challenge. Now, unfortunately, many of us who are in mental health, child welfare, in some of the public systems that work with families and children that have experienced trauma, we know that the pattern of stress that I'm describing is not what these folks have experienced. They've experienced unpredictable stress. They don't know what's going to happen. Their life is chaotic. Their community may be chaotic. Their school may have aspects of uncontrollable stressor. The stress may be extreme. They may be watching domestic violence. They may be victims of physical assault from the adults who are supposed to be caring for them. They may be victims of sexual abuse. And so the activation of the stress response is not moderate, it's extreme. And sometimes the other part of this is that you can have prolonged activation of the stress response. And I think everybody who's listening can relate to how challenging it is to have prolonged activation of the stress response. And in all of us who are kind of dealing with the 6 months of this pandemic and all of the changes in the way we work and the way we educate our kids, the way we protect ourselves, all of these unpredictabilities and these changes in our everyday life are causing significant stress. And it's not, as for most of us, these are not catastrophic stressors. For some people, obviously it is, but for most of us, it's just, it's changes in the plan, it's major inconveniences, it's inability to do the regulating things that we might have done in the past. And so the thing that's interesting and important to remember about prolonged stress is that it's exhausting. It literally is physically exhausting. It wears people down. And it wears them out. And people use the term bandwidth. And really, if you use that language, what's happening with prolonged stress is that your bandwidth is being consumed. and which means that you have less energy and less ability to give attention to other things in your life. And this is, I think, what a lot of people are experiencing over the last 5 or 6 months. There's a tremendous amount of fatigue, irritability, and really the people who are supposed to be providing consistent, predictable, nurturing environments for children are themselves becoming worn out. And I think that this is something that is extremely important to think about under the current circumstances. And it really is important when you're thinking about resilience. Let me just change speed here a little bit and put up this little drawing, little diagram. A lot of the work that we've done over the last 25, 30 years has been looking at how experiences influence the person, how do experiences shape you. And we've, being someone who works with children, I've focused on developmental experiences. And I've used the lens of the brain, of the biology of the brain. And so with the assumption, and again, it may not be right, but I think it's right. The assumption of really all of our work is that if you know a little bit more about how the brain works, you'll be a little bit more successful in understanding some of the things that you see around you in interpersonal interactions. You will understand things about how the brain changes better. And if you understand how the brain changes, it informs the way you parent. It informs the way you teach. It informs the way you approach therapy. Because in reality, all of those activities, parenting, coaching, teaching, therapy, all of these things are intended to change the brain. And so if you know how the brain changes, you'll be more successful at, that's our working hypothesis, that if you know these things, you'll be more successful at changing the brain. And so again, part of what we know is that the biology of the brain is so complex, and the rate at which we're learning about the brain is so rapid that it's almost impossible for any one person to even understand all of the various aspects of how the brain is, how the brain's put together. And in fact, if those of you who might know a little bit about the neurosciences or are neuroscientists, you know that there's an explosion of factual content about how the brain works that's almost impossible to keep up with. And so what we're forced to do when we're trying to teach these complex concepts is use models. This is a model. This is really not the way the brain looks. This is a diagram, a schematic that's trying to capture some aspects of the brain that I think are important. And let me just point out a couple of the key things. Even though this is a schematic, it is accurately capturing some really important points about how the brain is put together. The first thing is that the brain has a hierarchical organization. There are lower parts of the brain that are simpler in structure, and they regulate and mediate some of the simpler regulatory functions. And as you get higher in the brain, you start to get more complex structure, and you start to have these structures and these networks in these higher parts of the brain mediate more complex functions. Now, again, this is an oversimplification, but it's accurate enough and it's helpful in understanding a little bit about the brain. The key point of this slide, however, is this up here. So that is the top part of our brain is the cortex. And this is the part of our brain that really is most uniquely human. And the reason this is important is that so many of the targets of our teaching are intending to change systems in the cortex, systems that are involved in speech and language, systems that are involved in teaching the values of our people, systems in the brain that help us reflect on the past and anticipate the future. These are uniquely human to some degree and uniquely mediated by the cortex. And so if you're thinking about parenting and you want to teach your children right from wrong, you want to teach them where they've come from, as you want to teach them about, again, the values and beliefs of your people, you have to get to the cortex. And this is one of the most interesting and challenging aspects of understanding the brain. And once you understand this, many things become clear. But what I want to kind of emphasize here is that you can't get directly from the cortex, from your cortex to your child's cortex without going through the bottom part of the brain. And let me just put up a, let me see if, I'll use this. Well, I'll come back to that in a second. Let me do a couple little pieces of organization, teaching a little bit more about the brain before I get to that. So another key thing about the brain is this. Now, I think all of you, anybody who's sort of had trauma, Introduction to Trauma 101, you've heard about the hypothalamic, the HPA axis, and you've heard about cortisol, and some of you have heard about the amygdala. And there are a lot of different parts of the brain and body that are involved in the stress response. And part of what I want to get across with this slide is that there are really some really important, and I would call them essential, core regulatory networks. And these are neurotransmitter networks, and you've probably heard of many of them, the dopaminergic networks, the serotonin containing networks, the norepinephrine containing networks. All of these collectively originate in lower parts of the brain. And collectively, if you put them all together and looked at where they reach every single part of the brain. They directly communicate with literally every single part of the brain. They get everywhere. They also get out to every part of the body. And they get out to the body both directly through the autonomic nervous system. And I know a lot of you probably know of Stephen Porges' great work with the understanding the vagus nerve. That's part of the parasympathetic nervous system. They also get out to the body through the HPA axis and other hormones. And we know there's a very complex neuroimmune component to how the brain and body communicate with each other. So there are multiple routes by which the lower parts of the brain here communicate with and get information from the body. So this is a two-way street. Not only are these core regulatory networks sending signals out to the body sends signals back into these systems. So there's this feedback loop that's very, very important in maintaining equilibrium in the body. On top of all of this remarkable capacity to communicate, these core regulatory networks are continually getting input from the inside of our body. This is interoceptive input. And they're continually getting input from the outside world through our senses. And of course, in its perfect design, that the first place that all of these interoceptive and sensory systems stop, they don't send their information directly to the cortex. They send their information right here to the core regulatory networks. And depending upon what signals these systems get, they will then go through a very elaborate process of taking a look at that information and determining what systems should be on right now in my brain. What are the systems that I need right now in this moment? And let's say, for example, you're sitting and you are in a safe and familiar environment. It could be your living room in your apartment. And you're at the end of the day, you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not cold, you've got no complexities going on, you're listening to some familiar music, and you're just able to relax, you feel calm. And what that, basically, those incoming signals that are getting to these core regulatory networks are saying, hey, you can use this smart part of your brain. You can reflect on what happened during the day. You can plan your day tomorrow. You might even get into a little bit of a mind wandering where you think about what you want to do, your hopes and dreams for the future. You may reflect deeply on the past. You're able to use really the most complex and amazing parts of the brain. This is when you're in this state, your brain really is able to use all of its horsepower, so to speak. Now, if something happens, this very same person, moments later, could actually feel threatened. It could be that they hear a glass break and noises as somebody tries to crawl in the window of their apartment. And all of a sudden, they would go from a state of regulated active alert to a state of being frozen in basically partway down a full-blown threat response, trying to process what's going on. And what happens is, as you start to get threatened, as your brain perceives threat, you shut down some of the systems up here that are involved in reflecting on the future. You don't really need to be reflecting on what you ate for lunch yesterday. You don't need to be reflecting on, what you want to do, 2 years from now. You want to be dealing with the immediate threat. And so this is a general phenomenon. This is one of the most important, easy to learn pieces of information about the brain that we teach these things. We teach this to kids that are in pre-K. We teach this to kids that are in first grade, 8th grade. We teach this to teachers and cops. This is one of the most important principles of how the brain works. And we refer to it as state-dependent functioning. And essentially what we're saying is that when you're in one state, a state of calm, you have access to some parts of the brain. And when you're in a different state, when you're in a state of threat, other parts of your brain will be activated, basically all in service of trying to keep you alive. And these are this is a graded response. And we have a couple of different ways that we present that. I mean, one is a very kind of oversimplistic way like this. When you're calm and let's say that you have the cognitive capability of solving problems with, an average IQ or even a higher than average IQ. And if in this situation you're asked to solve a problem, it'll reflect how smart you are. It'll reflect your cognitive capabilities. But if you start to go out into the world and it gets busy and you're sort of focused on what's going on, you start to have a a decrease in your cognitive capabilities. And ultimately to the point where in this state, when you feel under threat and you're asked to solve a problem, there's a tremendous cognitive deterioration. And there's a lot of different interesting things that, studies that have looked at this. Part of what I think is, again, very important to appreciate is that your ability to demonstrate your best cognitively is very, very, very fragile. So if you're in a group, for example, and you are feeling like you're in the out group, you will literally start to problem solve in a way that reflects a much lower IQ than you actually have. And again, this is a reflection of state-dependent functioning. And I'll send this along for those that may be interested in learning more about this. But the point is this, is that going from here, let me use this, going from here, where you can reflect and use the smartest part of your brain, down to here, or even here, literally can take seconds. So this is another way that we reflect and teach about state-dependent functioning. And it's kind of a complicated slide, but it's useful, I think. In general, what we're trying to capture here is what happens with your cognitive capabilities and your mental, really as your mental state shifts with threat. And you can see that literally by the time you're fully afraid, that really low parts of your brain are in control of your functioning. And you're really not even thinking, you're reacting. And again, any of you who've worked with a child who has some kind of evocative cue that results in a meltdown, in those moments when they're on the floor rocking and you know that you can't reason with them. You can't talk them out of whatever you think is causing the problem. This is when these kids they really don't respond to words. They respond to tone of voice, gentle touch, other kinds of forms of communication. It's because their cortex, the part of the brain that processes language, is literally shut down. All right, let me go back. There's a lot of different, so let me go back to this. So we have this, we have these core regulatory networks. We have we have a set of incoming signals from the outside world coming into the lower parts of the brain through our senses. We have incoming feedback from our body that tells us what's going on inside our body, where we are in space. Do we have enough fluid? Do we have enough sugar in our blood? All of that feedback. Do we have enough oxygen? All that's coming into these lower parts of the brain. The first thing that happens here is the incoming pattern of neural activity is compared with the pre-existing stored memories from the past. And memory, a lot of people, when they think about memory, they're thinking about aspects of the cortex where you remember linear narrative memory. I went here, and then I went here, and then I went here, and then I went here. But neural tissue, neurons, neural networks can make associations, connections with information, that any information that co-occurs with sufficient frequency. And as I'll talk about it a little bit later, one of the most important aspects of development is creating a set of very, very important memories that have to do with having your fundamental needs met by a primary caregiver. And those memories aren't cognitive memories. Those are very primitive regulatory memories, emotional memory, motor memory, and so forth. But the bottom line is that these parts of the brain store experience. And your brain is, think of your brain as a meaning-making machine. It's trying to make sense out of the world. And the major mechanism that your brain uses to make sense out of the world is to connect things that co-occur. And so if you have two sensory signals that co-occur again and again and again, your brain begins to connect them. And so your brain can connect the sound of a moo, the moo of a cow. And if the child sees the cow in the same space and they see the sound, pretty soon the child's brain connects visual and auditory input, and they make sense out of the world. And that's how we do everything. We make a connection between a certain form of touch and having our fundamental needs met. We make a connection between a certain level of eye contact and being heard and seen and listened to. We make an association between a certain form of touch that's reassuring and strong and smooth on the back of our neck with being safe and satiated. So the first thing that happens, this information comes in, it gets stored against pre-existing signals. And if the incoming signals are familiar and safe, this part of the brain sends it up to a higher part of the brain to get processed. And then it sends it up to the highest part of the brain to get processed ultimately. Key thing here is that your brain processes information, and it processes the present moment sequentially. This is really important for understanding trauma, and is really important for understanding teaching, communication, and so forth. And so let me just walk through an example. So remember that we have these core regulatory networks that control this because of their architecture. These core regulatory networks right here are the backbone of the stress response. And so if incoming signals suggest that you're under threat, your brain will immediately activate something in change, what's going on in higher parts of the brain. It'll mobilize your brain and the rest of your body to help you respond to whatever the perceived threat is. So this is a little bit busy, but let me give you an example. Let's say that somebody was in combat 30 years ago. And when they were in combat, they had all kinds of, they were mortar attacks multiple times when they were in Vietnam, let's say. And their brain over time made a very powerful association between the sound of unexpected explosions and threat. So that memory exists in this person's brain. So 30 years later, this person is out on the 4th of July, or let's say that they're walking down the street, and it's not the 4th of July, it's just any regular day. They walk down the street, they hear a car backfire. But this loud, unexpected noise is so similar to an unexpected explosion that it activates this memory of combat, which then activates the stress response. Now, the stress response, under normal circumstances, there would be a little bit of processing here, and then processing here, and then processing up here. But because this was activated, this starts to shut down parts of the brain, particularly right here. This would be the amygdala. So your amygdala gets activated and says, hey, you're under threat. And so what it does is it shuts down all of the non-essential cortical things, thereby inhibiting efficient transfer of what this sound really is up into the cortex. And so for literally, it could be 2 seconds, 5 seconds, which is a lifetime for the brain. 2, 5, 7 seconds, that's a long time. But it might take 7 or 8 seconds before this combat veteran is able to have the cognition that that was a car backfiring. But before that happened, he actually took cover, activated his full-blown fear response. His heart rate's 130. He feels distressed, and he's having it basically, he's thinking about Vietnam. And that's what happens with an evocative cue. And the reason that evocative cues work is because the brain processes information sequentially from the bottom to the top. If we didn't process information sequentially, the sensory input would go up here to the part of the cortex and would immediately accurately be interpreted. You go, I'm not under threat, it's a car backfiring. Why should I worry? This is a really important point, because many trauma-related behaviors, threat-related behaviors, rather than being understood as being evoked, end up being thought of as something that was intended. This is particularly true with young children. Let's say that this is a child who has a teacher who is, a male teacher. And he's a really, he's a nice guy. He gets really excited and enthused about math. And, this is a kid who has a history of abuse and exposure to domestic violence. And when he was really young, mom had a boyfriend who essentially would get loud when he got drunk. And then when he'd get loud and get drunk, it would increase the probability that he was going to go after mom. And so what happens is, this math teacher has a loud, booming voice. And this child has a sensitivity to loud, male, booming voices. And here's what happens. Human beings, as you probably all know, we have this unique contagion to the emotions of the people we're around. And so here's the math teacher, and he wants to teach math. And because he gets so excited about math, he loves math, it goes through the emotional filter of his brain. See, the thing is, information doesn't go from his brain to that person's brain. It has to go through here, and then here, and then here, and then out here, and then through here, and up there, and up there. And there's a lot of places where this can go wrong. So let's math. He gets excited, it comes out. But because of the way human beings process information, we've spent a lot of time focusing on tone of voice and facial expression and the words. But this child has got this little landmine in his brain. It's put into his brain by him trying to make sense of the world as a young child and an abusive, loud, angry man. And so what happens is, rather than getting through those parts of the brain unfiltered, it starts to get distorted by his previous history with threat. And this child starts to activate his stress response, which shuts down his cortex, which makes it hard for the math content, the 7% of that communication from the teacher, to get efficiently to the cortex. What happens instead is that he hones in on the 93% of the communication that is reminiscent of him being in a domestic violence situation. And rather than saying, I'm going to learn a math concept, this kid goes, I'm not safe. And this happens, I can tell you, this happens in therapy interactions. This happens in foster parent-child interactions. This happens in teacher-student interactions, where there's some evocative cue, there's some internal landmine that the person has that results in them activating their stress response in a way that minimizes their capacity to learn the cognitive content and maximizes the probability that they're going to have a trauma-related behavioral acting out. Now, of course, in the classroom, if this teacher doesn't know anything about how the brain processes information, has never been taught about trauma, and this child, in the face of him coming over enthusiastically and trying to get him excited about math, this kid basically shuts down and either doesn't react at all or tries to flee. And when he tries to flee, the teacher tries to stop him. That results in a fight. This teacher will interpret that behavior as if there's something wrong with this kid. This kid's got, attitude, he's aggressive, he's impulsive, and this will lead to the kinds of misunderstandings that lead to marginalization, suspension, et cetera, et cetera. So state-dependent functioning and sequential processing are extremely important in understanding the kids that we're working with. Let me just come back and go back to this again, take a little bit of a deeper dive here. Now, and again, I always sort of question myself about the way I present this stuff. I always present it differently every time, but I hope you'll bear with me a little bit here, and hopefully this will make some sense by the time I finish. So here we are. Let's say that you've got a person who's neurotypically organized. And that means that basically that person who's neurotypically organized will have an appropriate internal activation of their stress response that's proportional to the external challenge. So if you've got a moderate challenge, let's say that here you are and you're supposed to give a presentation at a meeting, and most of us get a little bit anxious about public speaking. And so here you are, you have a moderate challenge. And so that's going to take you basically, you're going to get into the low level alarm state, and your stress response system will activate. But once the talk gets going and you realize it's okay, it'll be fine, you finish your presentation and you get some positive feedback, and your stress response system goes back to your baseline. And everybody has moderate challenges like this. It might be presenting about, at work. It might be the moderate challenge of, taking your driver's test, or whatever it is. Most people will have these moderate challenges and they master them reasonably well. And then later on, so with a certain spacing, after you've had an opportunity to get back to your baseline, you'll have another moderate challenge. And so that's kind of, the ideal. We're lucky enough to have moderate challenges. That's great. This is what happens with kids that have unpredictability, uncontrollability, and either prolonged or extreme stress responses. Now, and this is a lot of the kids that we work with. If you work with kids that have come from backgrounds where there's been sexual abuse, domestic violence, physical abuse, kids that have gone from home to home, poverty, racism, there's a lot of things that can create this unpredictable pattern of stress response. But what happens is that you can have a moderate challenge. Let's say that you're a child and you're going to take a test, and you want to do well on the test, and because you really like the teacher who's been supportive of you, and you go and you take the test, and it's over and you're walking home, but you're not yet back to your baseline. And on the way home, you run into somebody and they bully you a little bit. And now under normal circumstances, you deal with this person and kind of get along. But because you're already starting, the starting point for this is here. He bullies you when you're already kind of tuned up. You haven't gotten back to your baseline. And so what happens is you're going to actually be more impacted by that interaction than you would have been under normal circumstances. And then you get home and you find that there's someone there who is yelling at your mom. It's your mom. Your mom's a single parent, and there's some strange guy there, and they're having a fight, and you don't even know who that guy is, and so you're kind of scared, and so you're not even interpreting this interaction from your baseline. You're interpreting this interaction from this baseline. You're already tuned up. And so what can happen is you literally end up with what we call a sensitizing pattern of stress activation. And when that happens, you get a sensitized stress response, your baseline shifts. And this is kind of what happens. Let me find it. If you have this is the state reactivity curve. And what this indicates really is that relationship between the external challenge, which is down here, and your internal state, your internal response. And so if you're neurotypically organized and you wake up in the morning, you're in a safe, familiar place, your brain is basically in this active alert state. Now, you remember what I said before about state-dependent functioning and access to your cortex. This person has access to their cortex. They can use all of their, good thinking. They can be reflective still in this state. And then they'll go to work and there'll be some more stress, but because they have a neurotypically organized stress response system, even when there are moderate challenges, they're still able to have big parts of their cortex open for business. But let me go back and let's look at what happens if you are someone who wakes up in the morning, you're in a safe and familiar place, but if you have a sensitized stress response, your brain basically tells you and acts like you're under threat. And so you have this state-dependent cognitive compromise. And because of this, you're further along that table that I showed you before, that chart, where you're going to be more reactive. Your brain has already got you in this semi-fight or flight response. And if you go through the day, let's say you're either a student or somebody at a workplace, if you go through the day in that state, you're going to have trouble with your peers. You're going to have trouble processing the cognitive content of the class. You're not going to be able to follow through with the supervisor's directives at work. You're going to have significant problems. And then, of course, if there's a moderate challenge, you literally can have a complete meltdown. And many of us have seen this with these kids. One of the hallmarks of kids that have a trauma-related sensitization of their stress response is difficulties with transitions. It's the tiniest little thing, but these kids can have a complete meltdown when you ask them to go from one task to the next. This is a real challenge. Now, the way this translates into teaching these kids into developmental problems is that if you are a child and you're neurotypically organized, and as I said before, remember I said that learning, it requires stress. And so when your brain sees any incoming signals, any incoming information that's unfamiliar, the default response of the brain is to activate your stress response. And so when you activate your stress response and you're neurotypically organized, your brain treats the day's lesson as if it's a challenge, but you're able to stay in the active alert state, which means that you have access to the cortex, which means that the teacher who's trying to teach you this concept is going to be able to get it to your cortex. In other words, the dose of novelty that you can tolerate before it starts to be too much, too fast, and you start to get inefficient in how you process the information, it's a pretty big dose. But the dose of novelty that a sensitized child can take is very, very small. And this is a big problem with the populations that we work with. If you work with kids that have been sexually abused, physically abused, who have trauma-related sensitization of their stress response, they can only learn new things in tiny little doses. They need to be exposed in ways where there's a little bit of novelty, and then there's lots of opportunity for spacing, the time to consolidate and get back to their baseline. Now, the good news is, if they have opportunities for that kind of dosing, they will literally be able to change their baseline level of reactivity back to a less sensitized to a more neurotypical state. And let me just show you how that works. Moderate challenge for a child who's sensitized leads to a complete meltdown. And anybody who's listening who's worked with these kids, you know what I'm talking about. They'll either completely shut down or they'll blow up, and it will be just a behavioral mess. And the more you try to get them to comply, the more they escalate. If you put hands on to try to get them to transition from one space to another, they'll blow up, they'll fight, they'll bite, they'll kick, they'll spit. That's this. They're sensitized. But if they have a moderate, controllable dose of challenge, if you give them opportunities for a tiny little bit of control, you give them some predictability about what the challenge will be, and there's adequate spacing for them to get back to their baseline, and then they can repeat that and repeat that and repeat that. They end up having basically, we refer to this in this slide as a resilience building pattern. But in truth, from here down to here, this is a therapeutic pattern. Therapy really is having opportunities for these tiny little digestible bits of healing that are sometimes just seconds long. Sometimes they're 30 seconds long. Sometimes they're a minute long. But any of you who've ever done therapy, you know that it's very difficult to stay in that fully connected, emotionally intense therapeutic moment for that long. Kids will break out of it by using humor. They'll physically break away from it. They'll shut down. They'll be quiet. So therapeutic intimacy involves sort of staying distance and then getting close into this therapeutic healing moment, and then backing up, and then coming in again, and then backing up, and then talking about it again, and then using some distraction. And therapeutic work involves this back and forth, where in moments that are very brief, you have this intimacy that is, I believe, the healing moment in therapy. So this pattern, the good news is that this core regulatory network that I talk about all the time, that is so responsible for so many functions, that the sensitivity of these systems, it's malleable. They're malleable. When these systems are activated in certain ways, they'll become more sensitive and more reactive. And of course, what that means is, in every single part of the brain and every single part of the body that these networks influence, there will be increased risk for compromise. This is why kids that have developmental trauma have increased rates of asthma, increased rates of skin problems, GI problems. This is why they have difficulties with reading. They have difficulties with relationships. They have difficulties with their resting heart rate. They have difficulties with regulating reward and pleasure. They have difficulties with just about any brain-mediated function you can think of. It's because these core regulatory networks that go everywhere are sensitive and they may end up overactive and overly reactive. And then therapeutics involves the opposite pattern of this, and it involves this. Provide opportunities for dosing of small, predictable moments, and ultimately they can get back to their baseline. Now, this is the malleability of these systems is something that is important for us to be aware of, and the most important thing to remember about these little moderate predictable doses is that they take place in context of a relationship. And one of the things that I mentioned, and again, all of you know this, is that human beings are social creatures. We're designed to be able to read and respond to others. We're as a species, we survive by creating collaborative groups, cooperative groups. We are successful when we connect with others, when we share with others, when we create, problem solve together. That's what our species is all about. And one of the most important things about this contagion is the way in which the contagion flows. In other words, who is the person determining the emotional state in the environment? Is it the child or is it the parent? And I think most of you know that most of the time, by and large, the contagion, emotional contagion, flows down a power differential. And so most typically, the emotional tone in a classroom is determined by the teacher. The emotional tone in a household is determined by the parent. And this is a really important point, because if the teacher is dysregulated and overwhelmed, they're not going to be able to help children become regulated. But if a teacher or a parent can stay regulated, what happens is that contagion can help make dysregulated kids feel regulated. Unfortunately, I think one of the things that I see a lot is that by the end of the school day, you end up with a dysregulated teacher. And a lot of times that dysregulated teacher is, for number one, they're not going to be able to regulate the dysregulated kid. This is when these teachers who have sort of lost their cognitive control, they lose, basically it's the equivalent of losing some of your executive functioning. This is when you get more frustrated and you yell more, you make more demands, you act more immature, the more frustrated and overwhelmed and exhausted you get. This is challenging because if you're dysregulated, you can have a regulated child and you'll dysregulate the child, because that contagion flows both ways, Part of the problem is, of course, that we ask too much of one adult in our classrooms, for example. And a lot of times you may have a parent who's starts out the day pretty well regulated, and they may have 3 or 4 dysregulated kids in their home, or they may have 1 dysregulated child and 2 other kids that are regulated. But here the challenge is that one person is very rarely capable of continuously staying regulated in an environment where there are multiple children with multiple needs, unless that adult has some help. The modern world, we've written about this, we talk about this a lot. We end up asking so much more of our young parents than we ever used to in in the history of our species. It used to be that if you were, 200, 300, 400 years ago, if you were a young parent, you typically had aunties and uncles, grandparents around who would help with some of the caregiving tasks, so you would not be completely burned out. But the modern world has kind of let us have our own space. And in that own space, we've got little nuclear families with sometimes with children with multiple demands, and it can get overwhelming. All right, so let me see. The question, does this mean a dysfunctional adult cannot help a dysfunctional child? I don't want to make the full generalization that that's true. Let's just say this: it's a lot harder for an adult who's dysfunctional to meet the needs of a dysfunctional child. And usually they can get that pair can get into a negative feedback loop. So they may have intentions and they may try hard, but they're easier to make that dysfunctional adult become, or dysregulated adult get off balance. And this is why it's always great to have other people step up to help you with your caregiving if you're feeling overwhelmed or if you've got other challenges. Let me see, let me look at the time. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions and conversation. Let me stop sharing for a second and see if there are any comments or questions from panelists that about any of this content. Anybody, any thoughts, comments, questions?
Dr. Bruce.
Yes.
This conference is a very interesting and very I don't know how to say it, but it's a very good conference. But we are focused on sexual abuse. I would like to know if you can talk about that a little more.
Sure.
Thank you.
One of the, let me just go back and go to some slides here. And share that. So one of the things that we know about the process of early development is, and again, obviously sexual abuse can take place in a whole range of different ways. And one of the things that, I don't want to say that this is the most common, but I think it's important to remember that one of the not uncommon forms of abuse is intrafamilial sexual abuse, where a child growing up is basically exploited, either groomed or sexually abused by an adult that they know. And it may be a family member, it may be a relative, it may be a neighbor, but typically it is someone who is known to the child. And part of what happens in those situations that I think is particularly toxic is that the normal process of making sense out of the world and creating associations about what people are gets basically poisoned. So let me just take a minute here and talk about that process. Now, this is, I'm going to talk about this not specifically about sexual abuse, but I think that people who work with kids who have been sexually abused will kind of see where this is potentially really helpful. So what we know is that early in life, when your brain is organizing and you're trying to make sense out of the world, your brain basically takes all of these attributes of the primary caregiver. And let me just use this diagram. And this is kind of complicated, but let me walk you through it. So one of the key things that happens in the brain of the developing infant, and this is, pretend this is the infant, and they have there's a little blank there, because what I'm trying to convey is here's a loving, attentive, attuned caregiver who has normal neurobiological organization of attachment. This caregiver has developed positive associations between human interactions. They have healthy attachment neurobiology, basically. And part of that is because that caregiver had attentive, attuned, responsive caregiving when she was an infant, and that formed the basis for her neurobiology of forming and maintaining relationships, and now she carries that into being a parent. And so she's got this little infant. And what happens is, and let me just explain a little bit of this. This drawing right here is, I think most of you appreciate, is the brain. This VTA is basically, this is the ventral tegmental area dopamine. It's meant to indicate both this area and this area are parts of the brain that when they're stimulated, you feel pleasure. And so part of what happens early in life is that when you get hungry, thirsty, or cold, and you cry and you get distressed, remember that moderate activation of the stress response. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm cold, I'm going to cry. You cry, and because the caregiver is present and comes to meet your needs, they decrease the physiological distress. And when the decrease of distress happens, that stimulates the pleasure parts of your brain. So what's happening is that you're getting all of the somatosensory cues of this primary caregiver are coming into the brain, and you're getting your stress response system is getting quieted and your reward system is getting stimulated. And so your brain creates this remarkable three-part, we call it the triune association. Your brain makes an association. It makes connections between relationship, connection basically, and regulation and reward, pleasure. And so that basically creates the fundamental matrix of successful human development. And that's what attachment is. Attachment is a set of memories based on your primary relational experiences. And when you have an attentive, attuned, and responsive caregiver, that attachment's capability is positive and strong, and it forms the bedrock of healthy development as you get older. And so as a child develops, they have this combination. There are times when a caregiver may be angry or absent or unpredictable, and there are times when you have this present, attentive, attuned, and responsive caregiving. And everybody basically builds up an internal catalog of experience. In the beginning, these experiences are really powerful because these are the first experiences, and they're beginning to form the bedrock of your relational capabilities. And so if you're lucky enough to have all these positive interactions, and every once, nobody's perfect. There's some are going to be not so great. There'll be times when you might have a babysitter, sometimes when you might have an exhausted, sick parent but bottom line, if you're lucky enough to have all of these positive interactions, pretty soon your core internal set of associations about what people are, your attachment capabilities, basically are that people are good. They're positive. They're regulating. They're rewarding. They're going to meet your fundamental needs. And this is what happens in ideal circumstances. This is great. You know, this is what we want. And you end up thinking and building into your brain basically the belief and based on a lot of good experience that people are safe, regulating, and rewarding. And so when you meet a new person, your default is that they're going to be positive, they're going to be helpful, they're going to be positive. And what I might also add here is that part of the association you're making about being safe and rewarding is the form of touch that you're getting. And so you have a set of associations about what touch means. Touch is safe, touch is regulating, touch is rewarding. And as you get, ultimately, when you get to be of a certain age, this is really the basis of healthy psychosexual development as well.
Dr. Bruce.
Yeah.
What about the 6 strengths?
Let me, well, yeah, let me see. Let me go through those. Let me get this slide up here again. And give me a second to find these. What I wanted to do, and am I sharing my slides? I seem to have lost. Here we go. Let me go back to sharing my screen, sorry. Let me do this and then I'll jump right to the 6 strengths, because I think this is a really important thing for individuals who work with kids who've had sexual abuse. And that is when that attachment process takes place, and rather than making an association about people that they're positive and rewarding, you have a predominance of unpredictable, painful, threatening interactions, and your brain basically creates unhealthy attachment capabilities. And something's happened to my computer. And you end up with a sense that people are not safe, they're not predictable, and this leads to difficulties forming and maintaining relationships. It leads to difficulties with intimacy. It leads to difficulties with healthy psychosexual development. And this is something that can happen with kids that are brought up and groomed into incestuous sexual abuse, or if kids early on are in an environment where there may be an sexually abusive early relative who starts that process early in life. And I know that I was going to talk about the 6 strengths. Here are the 6 strengths that we talk about that are the key elements of positive developmental and educational settings. And part of what, let me just take a second and just talk about these for a second. One of the things that we know is that as you're developing, the nature and the timing of experiences you have makes a big difference in how these key neural networks organize and function. And that over time, we've kind of come up with these 6 key elements. And these are very similar to what other people who've looked at this converge on. And the bottom line is that one of the key things about healthy developmental experiences is that they are developmentally matched with where you are. Many times you may have a child who's chronologically one age, but does not have the developmental capabilities that are age typical. So again, kids that have had sexual abuse, physical abuse, chaos, and threat in their lives as they grow up, they may be chronologically 10, but they would only be, let's say, socially like a 5-year-old. So if you hope to help them develop and continue to make progress, you don't treat them like a 10-year-old with regards to social capabilities. You have to treat them like a 5.5-year-old. You have to give them age appropriate expectations. And this is very hard to do with kids that have had different kinds of abuse, because this splinter development is very, very common. The second thing, and this is something that's a major mistake, I think, in a lot of therapeutic work, is that we need to provide developmental experiences, both therapeutic and educational, that are rhythmic, that they're resonant with neural patterns. So for example, if you take the simple circadian rhythm of your ability to attend, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon is one of the hardest times to introduce any new complex abstract concept. It's easier to teach those new things early in the morning. Furthermore, the rhythm by which you introduce novelty, it has to be in little doses with spacing in between, because your brain needs time to, if you stimulate neurons to sort of make a synaptic connection, your brain needs consolidation time. And consolidation time really is required so that proteins can be made, they can be transported down to the end of the synapse, they can basically do the synaptic resculpting that's required to really learn something. And I think one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make is that they do things that are non-rhythmic in the way they introduce them. They hammer away at learn, with the hope that the harder you hit, the more you're going to make change. But the brain is a lot more like a piano than an organ. If you want to make continuous sound, you don't keep your finger on the chord. You have to tap it. You have to tap it, tap it. Make a noise, make a noise, make a noise, make a noise. The brain changes, in other words, makes noise, makes sound if you are tapping it and rhythmic, as opposed to just pushing down nonstop. Third thing is that whatever you do, it has to be sufficiently repetitive. And the brain, as it's trying to make sense out of the world and it sees things, if it sees things in a pattern, it will internalize them easier. If it sees things infrequently and it's not repetitive enough, what the brain will do is that it will take what you're presenting and it will seek an internal pattern that it best fits. And a lot of times that process of shortcutting and how to process this information is inaccurate. So you really don't learn the new thing. You just make the new thing that's being taught a version of something older that you've already internalized. This is a huge issue. And so if you really want to continue to make significant growth in any area, cognitive, social, motor, you need to do this new thing with sufficient repetition. The key in my mind to all of this really though is relationally mediated experience, whether it's cognitive, social, motor, is always much more efficiently internalized than non-relationally mediated content. And so you can put a child in front of a television or in front of a screen and have them, get exposed to all kinds of lessons and lessons and lessons and lessons. But they'll learn that content faster if there's a person that is sitting with them and interacting with them in an attuned way and helps them. And this is, unfortunately, I think our modern world is not fully appreciative of the power of these relational interactions. Finally, in terms of an experience that you want to lead to positive development, people are not going to repeat things if there's not some element of pleasure. And so that's really what human beings, we repeat things that give us some pleasure. And now the good thing is that there's pleasure in mastery. And so when you're teaching something and someone has an opportunity to master it, particularly if they're in the presence of a person who can give them a relational reward, like, wow, that's good, you did this, that's amazing, that will lead to positive change and repetition, and the willingness to leave your comfort zone to explore and continue to expand your horizons. And finally, if the work that you're doing, if the environment isn't respectful to the child and the family and the culture, you're really not going to be as effective or efficient, and you're not going to build in the things that you want for the child to learn. And so, I could go, obviously, as anybody, you realize that each one of these, you could spend an entire hour talking about them, but these are the 6 R's that we kind of use when we're doing our work, and both therapeutically and in educational settings and in other settings. And there, if you go to our website, there's some readings and some other conversations about this that you guys can have access to. So. I think I'm.
Dr. Bruce.
Yes.
I have some questions here. Let me ask you the first one.
Sure.
This says, as a therapist, what you can do when you start feeling dysregulated in session? That's
a really good question. That's a great question. I'll tell you what I've done a couple of times. There have been times, now I have to say, I've done this with adults and I've done this with children. It's a lot easier with children because honestly, children are very forgiving.
With children.
Yeah. So I'll usually just say, listen, I hate to say this, but I'm really tired. I've had a really, I was up late, tell whatever the reason, and tell the truth and say, listen, let's go walk down and I'm going to get some coffee and we can talk while we're walking. And so I will literally get up and we'll go walk. And I have to say that there have been times when that gesture has led to more intimate conversation than trying to fight through and act like you're present when you're like falling asleep or when you're feeling upset about something. And there have been times that I've literally said to people, listen, I've got this thing going on and it's not fair to you that I waste your time because I can't be fully present right now. And so let's reschedule or I'll give them an opportunity to connect with me a couple of times before the next session in ways so they don't feel like they're being abandoned. But I try to be honest. Now, there are other things that I've done. I mean, a lot of times I've found that if I do tiny little rhythmic things myself, it can be helpful. So like I have a rocking chair. And so when I rock, I'll find that I get a little bit more regulated. I actually have learned self-hypnosis. So I use that when I realize that I'm missing, then I can go through a little 30-second induction, and then I am a little bit more focused. So.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce. The second question is, it says from Yadira Gonzalez. She says, if a child has been abused, does he has a probability to be a functional and happy adult?
Here's the good news. The good news is the majority of people who have been abused don't go on to be abusers. The majority of them go on and live a life where there's lots of health and they can form relationships. It's not an inevitability. It's not a sentence that bad things will happen. There are a lot of people who, the key thing I think, for healing from trauma is to be in the presence of people who are loving and attentive and care for you. And you're providing that for the child. And I would have every expectation that will be able to buffer some of the adversities and some of the challenges that go with having had abusive experience. Many, many, many. I mean, it's amazing how many people who are magnificent, creative, productive, inventive, compassionate people who had histories of abuse. Maya Angelou, Oprah Winfrey, just literally there's many, many, many people grow up to be successful adults who have had histories of abuse.
Dr. Bruce, another question is, when you talk about the therapeutic moments with the child, you mean that that they talk about the problematic of the child with him?
Therapeutic moments can involve talking about, whatever the event was that's upsetting them. But sometimes a therapeutic moment can be this open sharing of a fear. And it might not be a fear about what happened in the past. It might be that being truly open about, I'm afraid about going to school because I don't want to do poorly. And so I view therapeutic moments as any moment where somebody shows this vulnerability and reaches emotionally across the space to bring me into an interaction that's healthy. And I view that as therapeutic because we're building a new association, a new connection in the child's brain that is healthy. And sometimes that's what's required to offset opportunities in the past where interpersonal interactions were negative or hurtful or toxic. So I think I'm out of time. And I want to make sure I think, let me see. Are there any more? I think. So I know there's a million things that I didn't get to. And as most of you could probably see from some of my slides, I had one slide presentation open and it had like 300 slides. So there's a lot of content to cover, and I'm hopeful that you all will have the rest of your meeting will go successfully. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much for all of your work, and gracias. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bruce. We really appreciate, and it is an honor for us that you share your time with us and your knowledge. And we want also to thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Para todos los demás, bueno, en breve comenzaremos la conferencia con la doctora Diane Vines. Entonces vamos a tomarnos 15 minutos de receso y volvemos. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, Dr. Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Adiós.
Thank you. Thank you. Gracias a todos. Los esperamos en la próxima plática. Muchas gracias. Moy está silenciado.
Sí, Alice.